We've all heard of the classic American dream. If you work hard enough, you can achieve anything. But this wasn't always possible. Sometimes we forget about the people of the past who didn't have this opportunity. Go back to the mid-19th century, when countless men, women, and children traveled grueling distances and endured many challenges in search of a better life. Back then, the American dream was fueled by the Oregon Trail, wagon trains, and the promise of striking gold.
The gold rush began in California, and the U.S. annexed the huge Oregon Territory and also took what is now our Southwest as spoils in the Mexican-American War. So the people who were heading out west either wanted to strike it rich in the gold rush or they wanted to claim free land.
That's author Winifred Gallagher, a historian and author of New Women in the Old West, From Settlers to Suffragists, an Untold American Story. Gallagher says gold and the possibility of a better life drove hundreds of thousands of families to relocate west almost 2 centuries ago. While there were some African Americans and Asians in the group, the majority were white Anglo-Saxon Protestant farmers or artisans. These men and women were used to hard manual labor and today would be considered middle class since they had enough savings to migrate out west. Gallagher points out that for women especially, this move was difficult and there was some apprehension.
They really faced a series of childbirths and really backbreaking domestic labor. It was a hard life for most women. That's why so many women were interested in fleeing to the cities. By the same time Western migration was going on, America was urbanizing very rapidly, and life was much easier for women in the cities. They were able to get around. There was transportation, and there were bookstores, and there were newspapers, and shopping was easier, and life in general was a lot easier in urban areas. So, first glance, the women who went west appeared to be going backwards in time to a worse period for women, but in fact they encountered some special advantages once they got to the west.
Most women who relocated to the west did so with their husbands. In the 19th and 20th centuries, it was common to be married at the young age of 14 or 15. In much of the country, these young women had little independence or say in the direction of their lives.
Women's position in larger American society was awful. The women's place was only in the home. They were second-class citizens. They had very few legal rights or economic opportunities. For quote-unquote respectable women, marriage was the only career that was acceptable. And once you were married, a wife could not own property, divorce, have custody of her own children. Women were considered inferior to men in every way except virtue. They had a certain moral authority over matters of right and wrong, and that moral authority was really their only form of power.
But as these women left bustling towns and cities and migrated out west, new opportunities took shape. Ladies of the West enjoyed more freedoms than their counterparts out east or in the South. Many stepped into leadership roles during this era and were vital in the construction of the first schools, churches, and charities. Women were also outnumbered by single working men, and this unequal balance gave them greater leverage.
Women in this environment, single women, had their pick of suitors, and unhappy wives soon availed themselves of America's first divorce mills. California very rapidly became the divorce capital of the nation. Women also benefited from the West's simpler, more experimental settler society. Every pair of hands was needed to get all the work done. No one had time to worry about whether it was man's work or woman's work. And that kind of flexibility enabled women to become more equal by acting more like equals.
Gallagher says that in heavy mining areas, ladies were such a rarity that towns created new laws that appealed to women.
One of my women arrived in Sacramento. There were 6,000 men, and she was one of 3 women. So the Western legislatures wanted to attract more white women. That was one of the reasons why they went for suffrage much earlier. But before suffrage, they tried to lure women with increased property rights and the ability to sue in court and the ability to divorce. They weren't that invested in an unhappy couple staying together for moral reasons. And in an environment where there were so many more men than women, if a woman wasn't happy with a husband who abused her or who beat her and her children, she could just leave, and she was not considered a pariah the way a divorcee might be back east. She would very rapidly have her pick of another husband.
On top of greater freedoms in relationships, women also had more opportunities to get an education from a co-ed school.
One remarkable career opportunity was provided by the government. In 1862, Congress passed the Morrill Land Grant Act, which created about 100 tuition-free public colleges throughout America, but 67 of them, most of them, were in the West. And in the West, most of these schools were coeducational, which was a very radical advance at the time. Indeed, these Western land-grant co-ed schools were some of the first coeducational colleges in the world. So this means that at a time when Eastern girls were going to Vassar and Smith and Wellesley, single-sex schools, the Western women were being educated with men and exchanging views with men and male students, male teachers. Also, now they had a career alternative to marriage. So many graduates became teachers. The West was desperate for teachers. But many others, one of my favorites is Bethania Owens Adair, who graduated from medical school at the age of 40. She was one of about 15% of Western women who entered traditionally male professions, such as medicine and law, and that's compared to the national rate of 8%. So that's almost twice as many Western women became professionals as women did back east.
Gallagher tells the story of Elizabeth Ensley, an educated African-American woman whose parents were former slaves.
She married a college-educated black man. They both taught at Howard University's Normal School. That's a school that teaches teachers how to be teachers. And then they migrated to Colorado, which, like California, was known to be a kind of more liberal-minded state that attracted a number of African-American settlers. And once she got to Colorado, she was a passionate suffragist, and she was, of course, much better educated than most women of any race at the time.
Ensley went on to become the founder and secretary of the Everybody's Equal Suffrage League during a time when the suffrage movement itself was divided.
This was an integrated suffrage organization at a time when, even within the suffrage movement, a lot of the groups were segregated. So she really made an outstanding difference. She was, a political voice in Colorado by the turn of the century.
The strong females of the new frontier banded together to push for more rights within their careers, relationships, and as citizens of the United States. In fact, this population was the first to have the right to vote. To find out more about the women of the Wild Wild West, visit viewpointsradio.org. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Gary Price. This segment is brought to you by Capital One. With one of the best savings rates in America, banking with Capital One is the easiest decision in the history of decisions. That's banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Terms apply. See CapitalOne.com/bank for details. Capital One N.A. Member FDIC. Coming up on Viewpoints.
There were many, many days where I felt overwhelmed. I remember I would cry about how hard life felt back then.
The financial benefits of investing in yourself long-term. Then,
there's so much to do before a dead body is buried or burned, but we don't see it.
A look at one growing trend, green burials. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.